Welcome to Malignant Myths. My name is Kristiyana.
And I'm Athalia, and we are oncologists by day and mythbusters by
Well, all the time.
all the time. Yeah. Today's show is about fertility, the myths and the evidence and the real story. And the reason we wanted to cover this important topic, apart from the fact that it's a topic that is rife with misinformation, is that both you, Kristiyana, and I have been through IVF. In my case, my husband and I are still deep in the trenches, having just done our fourth egg retrieval cycle and after one failed transfer last year. But we're feeling optimistic, and in part that's because, Kristiyana, you have a great success story.
Yes, we're all rooting for you, Athalia. And yes, my husband and I are incredibly lucky after a very long IVF journey to have two incredible children who are 5 and 2.5 now and thriving. But because of our story, I've been very passionate about helping others who've been through and on the road of this very unfortunate journey and part of this awful club, which is the reason why we decided to focus on fertility for our podcast today. And today's guest is Dr. Erica Bove. She's a double board certified OBGYN and reproductive endocrinologist, a physician at the University of Vermont. She's also the CEO and founder of Love and Science, Thriving Through Infertility. She has keen interest in marrying an evidence-based approach with intuitive knowledge in the context of a trusting relationship. She empowers women physicians to build their families with confidence, self-compassion, and community. And her mission is to heal and support the healers and to create a legacy she's so proud of, which is
Welcome
so
to the show,
wonderful.
Erica.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here.
Great. So we're going to dive right in. Erica, what is the definition of infertility? How does a doctor decide you have it? And
Absolutely. So it's interesting. The American Society of Reproductive Medicine has recently revised its definition to be more inclusive, which I'm very happy about. But I will say that infertility is traditionally defined as, in a heterosexual couple, of course, over 12 months of unprotected intercourse under the age of 35 without a pregnancy, and then 6 months after the age of 35. And the newer definition now says, or anybody who has infertility due to lack of sperm exposure, like for instance, same sex couples, single women, trans folks. So, I think it's really important to now know that it's a more inclusive definition. But I think many people see me after trying for, I kid you not, I've had people see me after 19 or 20 years of infertility. And I
My
think to
wow.
myself, like, has this person been in the medical world? Have they had appointments? So I think we really have to say it's really 6 to 12 months. Or if somebody has irregular cycles, that's a pretty unlikely chance they're going to get pregnant without assistance. And also if somebody has a big history of risk factors for fallopian tube disease, like, pelvic inflammatory disease or multiple abdominal surgeries, that's somebody where I would not wait the full 6 to 12 months. I would just see a specialist. So I always like to add that little caveat.
How about insurance? Will they cover if it's before that, or are they really strict about that?
That's a great question. It really depends on the insurance company. It's, everything in insurance is so all over the map. So I always, it's interesting. I always try to give the most generous sort of description in my notes. So a lot of people will say, well, we got married and we stopped the pill, but we've really been trying for 8 months. And I'm like, okay, so, but you got married like 5 years ago. You know what I'm saying? So I think sometimes people self-define, whereas I say, okay, or I go back and say, okay, well, were there any periods of time when you weren't contracepting and you weren't trying, but you didn't really consider that? Because that's actually infertility too. So I really try to, in a very honest way, be as accurate as possible, because sometimes that helps people with coverage, whereas they might not have it if they just sort of described it the way they see it.
That's true patient advocacy in action,
Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
Erica, can we unpack the difference between declining birth rates and declining fertility?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you asked this question. So I was recently a guest on the Vermont Public Radio because they were trying to understand, childlessness in the state of Vermont, where I practice, where I do my medical practice. And it is virtually impossible to figure out, because the thing is, so fertility rates and birth rates, people lump them in all the time. But what people are usually talking about is birth rates, not fertility rates, because you'd have to get in the mind of every single woman of reproductive age and say, what is your intent? Are you trying? Are you contracepting? Are you delaying childbearing? Like, what is your personal story to be able, and that is like an impossible metric to have, right? So you can, go to a fertility clinic and pull that data. You can try to do surveys in the general population, but like, to my knowledge, that data is really hard to parse out. And so I think what people are actually talking about, even when these headlines say fertility rates are declining, they're actually talking about birth rates. And like, just to put some data around that, because I know Mythbusters, we like data. Basically, right now in the US, women are having 1.6 children on average, right? If you look at women. And when you look at what you need to sustain a population, it's 2.1. I understand there's going to be some loss in things. And so that number is declining, but is it because people are having children or trying to have children later and being unsuccessful? Is it because people are contracepting? I can't tell you how many people I've talked to, because I wear a more broad gynecology hat as well. Like, with the state of the world, I'm not sure I want to bring a child into this world with the environment, like the environmental concerns and the political climate and everything. And so it's really an impossible number. So I think we have to be very careful when we're like, oh my gosh, we're not going to be able to sustain ourselves, versus are there other factors related that are sort of really muddying these numbers?
So important. And we're going to come back to politics again in the podcast, although we try and remain bipartisan in our coverage. But right now, let's zoom in on this potential myth that we're going to try and tackle today, which is zooming in just on fertility rather than birth rate. And that kind of like feeling that we have, and maybe social media is feeding us in some way, that the modern world, our environment that we're living in, is in some way making us infertile. The food, the water, the who knows what. And, it's probable that like a lot of headlines and social media narratives are sort of feeding into that and fueling public concern. What's your take on all of that?
Sure. So I do think our world today is less healthy than it was many years ago. I think we do have more toxins. I think we do have, different factors, especially for women, that make it hard to do all the things. I also think that if you look at humans in general, kind of zooming out, we are very inefficient at reproduction in general. So like, let's just talk numbers. A woman at the age of 25, who's technically kind of at the peak of her reproductive potential, every single month, if she's having intercourse with her husband, if she has a husband, every single month, she at best has a 20% chance of getting pregnant, right? And about a 15% chance of miscarriage if she does get pregnant. And so that's like actually our ceiling, if you look at sort of what's the best that it gets. And, when I was a med student 20 years ago, they said, oh, 1 in 8, couples has infertility. Now it's 1 in 6. I think it might be, we could talk about this in a bit too, like sort of more people are seeking help. And so we're diagnosing it more. But I think that we really have to think about sort of like what's going on here, because we are inefficient as humans. Even with our technologies, we don't see 100% rates. And I think the environment is one vector. It is definitely not the whole picture. And so, when I see people who are, having infertility, I always ask about, environmental exposures and diet and things like that. But if you think about it, it's just one piece of the puzzle that, yes, sometimes can be modified. So I think that's why maybe we latch onto it, because we like to control things. But, there's other things that are bigger pieces of the pie that have bigger weight in this sort of equation of what's going on for people. And so I think we have to remember that as well.
And I've heard even as high as 1 in 4 quoted specifically for women physicians.
Female physicians, and actually, Kristiyana, 1 in 3 female surgeons. 1 in 3 female surgeons. And so I do think there is something about the sleeplessness and the stress. And I mean, I've done a lot of deep dives into the literature about, why is it that female physicians have higher rates compared to others? Because age matched, it still doesn't make sense. And so I do think that there's something about the cortisol response in our systems and the irregular schedules and just the stress, which again, stress is complicated because it's like, oh, we just blame the woman, for being too stressed when we have a whole system that doesn't support women in medicine. So I think we do that is a variable that is important. but it's also not the whole picture. And it's not like we're falling off of a cliff worldwide. Interestingly, like, you look at the headlines, I've heard the term like spermageddon. I mean, that is just fear mongering, or sperm apocalypse. And it's just like people, like, I think people, the media is there, it's monetary, right? And so, but I think we really have to say, like, we're not falling off any cliff. We have to look at the big picture. There's some things we can modify. There's some things we can't modify. Sometimes we think we can't modify our job, but guess what? We actually can. And so, in many situations, we can make modifications. We can, sort of negotiate. So there's that. But yes, female physicians do have higher rates compared to the general population. And I think the nature of our jobs is probably a variable. Yeah.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
If you look at, because I'm a stressed person, I'm an anxious person, and of course I blame myself for our ongoing infertility issues, although there are many other factors I'm sure at play. And the stress of having to deal with the stress is what it's like, the fear of fear. Well, there's that famous quote. And then I look on the news, and there's so much strife around the world. There's war zones, there's famine, there's terrible atrocities going on, and you look at those populations, and it doesn't seem to be that their fertility rate is down. People who are going through war and people going through famine somehow still manage to have a lot of children. And I'm thinking, can it really be cortisol? Surely these people are stressed out of their mind. They're struggling to survive. Sure. And so that feeds into my personal vulnerability into believing all of this. Oh, you know what? It's the BPA in my Tupperware in my cupboard, or it's my my room freshener. Like, how much stock should I put in any of that? Do I need to get rid of the room fresheners?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So, I mean, I am obsessed with this topic because I want to help my people. And so I think you raise a very good point. I tell my patients that all the time. There's war zones around the world. People do not have different, fertility rates in those they're having children. So if that was really the case, you'd see this. I think that there's individual variations and individual sort of nervous system. It's so hard to measure. And I'll answer your question about the Tupperware. But I think that if we had a better way of measuring stress, we'd have much better data. If you want to look at her stuff, if you haven't already, her name is Dr. Ali Domar. She is a PhD psychologist who's dedicated her life to stress and infertility. She's fabulous. She's written so many books. She has an article from 2018, actually, that looks at that time, the ways that people have looked at stress and infertility. She quotes a study that looked at hair follicle cortisol levels, which measures the stress in the last 3 to 6 months for people on the journey. Also salivary levels of hormones as well. So, and also right now, some of the more like biometric data of all these wearables that people are wearing in terms of heart rate variability, and really trying to get some physiological data around, what is the baseline, what happens with maybe some mindfulness interventions. Is there a benefit? Is there not a benefit? There is some emerging data that maybe there may be, again, one of those small vectors that people can affect in a positive way. And so I'm open to it. My own personal experience in helping women regulate their stress, there seems to be something that helps and helps people also feel better. But again, I think until we can have a better way of measuring the stress, it's going to be really hard to come out with really concrete data. Okay.
I think that's my argument, if I can just chime in, and then we can get back to the Tupperware. But the argument I've heard and what helped me on the journey is that it's impossible not to be stressed when going through IVF. I think all lost our minds at different parts of the journey, and yet there are lots of successes. And so it's not all about stress at the end of the day. That was a part that helped me a lot to be able to regulate, because otherwise the more you stress about being stressed, the more stress you would be
exactly
overall.
And I think just taking a very mindful, self-compassionate approach, and for me, it doesn't feel good when I'm stressed about anything in general. And so my coaches and my therapists and everybody are like, okay, how can we calm your nervous system? Even if the only outcome is that it makes you feel better on a day-to-day basis, it's worth it, And so I think about that as like, how am I taking care of myself? How am I nourishing myself such that even worst case scenario, I just feel better, and then maybe there will be a better effect in these other areas of my life. I think we're so used to, as female physicians, just feeling crappy all the time and like not peeing in between patients and not eating and staying up late doing things. And it's like, I think we have to just challenge that narrative of like, I actually deserve to pour into myself in these ways. And maybe what is our baseline is not, necessary and not good for me in general. Forget all these other, sort of health outcomes. And there are data that female physicians, die earlier than people in other populations too. So I think we can't ignore that either. Yeah.
Let's hope this podcast takes off and then we can quit the day job. No, I'm joking.
I know, seriously, right? Right. Okay. But yes, I do want to also address your question about the endocrine disrupting chemicals and such.
Yeah, before we get emails from Big Tupperware to our legal department.
I mean, admittedly, I will be, sorry, I try to be very transparent when I, speak on podcasts. I actually yesterday just ordered stainless steel Tupperware myself because I, looked at the data and I was like, okay, well, these chemicals are not just sort of, I don't think there's causal data. I think there may be an association, some of an association, right? We can talk about in the environment, but there's actually some evidence that these phthalates are potentially related to cardiovascular disease and death. And so, and I'm, I have children and, thinking about sort of like, okay, how can we create the best environment possible? And if this is a variable, I was talking with somebody who worked in a plastics lab a few days before that and said, it's not just the BPA, the BPA has been most studied. There's other things too. And so if it is possible to like, stainless steel water bottle versus a, water bottle I get at Costco, that's reusable. Well, first of all, it's better for the environment to reuse my same stainless steel water bottle. But maybe there'll be a health benefit as well. If I'm at, Disney World and I happen to, you take a water bottle, am I going to die? Like we do our best. I think that's the point is that especially female physicians can get so unself-compassionate, self-judgmental. Well, it's because I, had the one pastry this one day or that came in this container. It's because X, Y, Z. And I think we have to zoom out and look at the big picture and say, as long as we're doing our best, most of the time, otherwise it just becomes this prison that we live in. So what did the data show? So, we do know that we live in a world with more toxins. And I will say not just the toxins that we aren't really aware of. I will say in Vermont, about 40% of my men smoke marijuana regularly. And I don't know, I think that there's a lot of anxiety in society. And so we treat our anxiety with various substances. And so I always zoom out and say, okay, what do you put in your body? do you smoke? Do you chew? I cannot tell you how many people chew tobacco. And that's even worse than cigarette smoking. So that's something. And then marijuana, I mean, we literally see, and maybe your listeners will find this kind of funny, but not funny, is that the sperm literally swim in circles. So when I'm trying to tell my partners, I'm like, dude, your sperm are stoned. You need to stop this. Like you need to and we'll have people even go through IVF with such poor outcomes. And the guy is like smoking marijuana like 2 or 3 times a day. And I'm like, these two things are not compatible. Like we've got to help you with your life. And then we'll address the fertility if we need to. But like, it's kind of like having like that leaky boat. So I think we really do need to give the lifestyle approach like a real look, because I think that there are some situations where, it's an obvious contributor. But I think most of my female physicians with infertility, I mean, it's kind of like, they're doing all the right things and it's still not working. And so then what to do? So, when you look at people who have, if there was one study, I think it was from 2023 that looked at people, sort of with and without infertility and showed that people with infertility had like, a higher rate of these chemicals in their blood. But it was like a small study. And so, that's certainly not a causal association. Maybe there's a correlation there, hard to say. There's also animal data that when you expose rodents to these phthalates, and we'll talk about phthalates, like where do you find them, how do you avoid them, but that these rodents actually went through menopause earlier, which I think is really fascinating data, because I think there probably is something that is sort of toxic to the ovary, sort of the ovary organ in and of itself and the glands, but does that clinically relevant? Just like the sperm have decreased over time, but now seem maybe stable. Like, is that a clinically meaningful decrease, or do we just see it in numbers and freak out about it? So, I do think there's something there. Although, like I said, there's plenty of people who've been using Tupperware their entire lives, et cetera, who are not experiencing any infertility issues whatsoever. And so, if you look at the literature of how to avoid these phthalates, it's like, okay, avoid plastics if you can, be fragrance free if you can, limit processed foods, organic foods. But again, sometimes we're creating this sort of unachievable standard as well. And also look at the labels, like anything that says like DIP, DBP, DEHA, it's oftentimes like nail polishes and like cosmetics and things we actually could avoid.
Gosh, I've gone natural. I've taken the gels off. I read that paper the other day saying there's an association.
Right. You're doing all the right things, right?
You clutch the low-hanging fruit as a control thing. There's so many things in this that we can't control about whether this cycle works or that cycle works. This is one thing I can do to take back a little control. Whether
that's exactly it.
Not,
so it's great. It's great that you did that. And in all truthfulness, it's probably just one little sliver of the larger pie. So I always help my patients and my clients say, okay, serenity prayer, again, non-religiously, but like, what are the things I can control? What are the things I can't control? What's the wisdom to know where that difference lies? And so how can I focus my energy on, the things I can control, and then stop putting energy into the things I can't control, and then get more energy for the things that actually bring me joy,
That's a great attitude.
Yeah.
So let's shift a little for a second then and talk politics and talk about why we're in this situation in 2025 where we have all of these half myths and half truths going around and who's putting them out there. Mm-hmm. And the question really is like, why are there so many conspiracy theories that focus around fertility rates? It's not a new thing. I don't know if it's like a eugenics, nationality thing, or does it represent like reflect a broader kind of politicization of reproduction? I'm thinking here about like The Handmaid's Tale, like dystopian fiction often centers around like dramatic drops in fertility rates, and that's what the rogue government uses to kind of take over. And so, we have all these conspiracy theories like they're sterilizing us through the X, Y, or Z, the vaccines, the food, the chemicals. Like, why is that so compelling to people? Why has it been throughout recent history?
Yeah, I mean, I think on a very neurological level, we are sort of wired to reproduce. And I think that's why, and not every woman feels called to become a mother, I want to make that clear. But for many women, there's a very strong biological drive to become a parent. And, there's also like this biological clock that, people feel ticking. And when that is threatened, I have this belief, and I've not seen data. I'd love to see data like an fMRI, but like, I firmly believe that when the fertility information comes in, it completely bypasses the frontal cortex and it goes straight to the amygdala. It goes straight to the hippocampus. It goes to our fear centers. And so I just wanted to say that that's sort of something that is very compelling. That it's almost like it's our hindbrain, like our brain stem, and not anything else. And so I think we have to be very mindful that when we have sort of fear mongering, that women are especially vulnerable to that because of this way that many of us are wired for the generation of the species, right? Like, it's not like we just have this like, oh yeah, I desire this. It's actually how our species has sort of promoted itself like teleologically. So that's really important to understand. So I don't really think that, go ahead. Do you have something to say?
Yeah, no, I mean, I hear what you're saying, but, playing devil's advocate again, I feel like, a lot of government is male centric, right? Like that's just the situation that we live in. And so it's got to be a lot of men that are pushing this stuff. And so it's not their brain pathways. Is it because they're being left out of the fertility conversation? Like, why is it coming from them? It's not their uterus.
Right, exactly. And so I think what I was saying was setting the stage for why we're especially vulnerable to these sort of narratives and decisions. And so I think the perfect example for this is like the hashtag tradwives. Are you familiar with that movement?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I think that perfectly represents what is sort of happening here and the politicization of women's bodies, because I think that we are throwing out like 50 years of progress, 50 plus years of progress with, women's rights and liberation. I think that when you look at sort of the way that women's brains are now being programmed to think about things, even I myself, I got married in my like early to mid 20s, I think probably because I was afraid I was going to be infertile and I was going into OBGYN and I knew I really wanted children. And so I married the wrong person, for me to be clear, and had a terrible divorce and still continues to cause tremendous pain in my life. My children are the greatest blessings in my life. And the other side of that coin is, this experience I had of like feeling this pressure to marry so early and reproduce and not have infertility, like that was actually forefront in my mind. I think that has then led to all of this pain and all of this suffering that continues on to this day. And so I think that, when we sort of plant in the minds of women, like you can do it all. And, you have to start reproducing. Even, I was talking with a medical student yesterday, she's 31, and she's already worried that she's not going to have children. And does she freeze her eggs, or does she, start having children with her partner? She's not sure he's the one. And all these questions, like, this is when women are preoccupied with those sorts of things, they don't then have energy for the larger societal changes that we actually need. So it's kind of like when you don't allow women to rest, there's this whole movement about women and rest, then and also keep us isolated from each other, we lose our collective power so that the patriarchy can stay established. And so I think all this fear mongering is keeping the men in power. It's keeping men and women in a heterosexual way marrying, reproducing on the early side. Many times women don't even get a chance at an education. And, and the ones who do are in this sort of, what do I do about this? Because society is not built for, me to do all the mental labor and the mothering and the careering and all these things. And so I think it's actually highly calculated and very much trying to sort of go back to a situation where women have even less say and control.
Gosh, and that's such a great segue into the last question in this little section about politics. We could probably delegate a whole episode to talking about government involvement in birth rates, restrictions in reproductive care, and governments being involved in determining like the rate of their society's one-child policy in China. And I know Japan, we went to Japan on our honeymoon, and we have a friend there, and she's doing IVF now, and she was telling us that the government pays for the majority of as many cycles as they need because their workforce crisis currently. And our current politicians talk the talk of wanting to promote family and children, and also talk the talk of against immigrants coming in and having children, and the kind of the replacement conspiracy theories. But I guess it comes down to the question at large, which is, if our government in America is so hell-bent on driving reproduction, then why is IVF so expensive? Why is access so poor and magnify social disparities? And why don't we have affordable childcare and good maternity-paternity leave policies like in Europe?
Yeah, it's very inconsistent. And, it's also interesting. It's like, okay, well, even if you get pregnant, we're going to take away your, rights to make choices about your body in the face of a complicated pregnancy and various things. And so, I do not know why we do not support more IVF coverage. Now, what I will say is, I have friends across the country who live in states where IVF is literally being threatened, and they have like a whole part-time job. Some of my friends say even they spend 20 hours a week going to their state house, testifying. It's women's, they lump fertility care in with abortion. And so, there was a bill proposed that would say that even an insemination would be a felony. Right. And so I have kind of insider into the politics of this, and it's fascinating. I really think it's because, again, trying to stay as bipartisan as possible, but the people who are in power are accessing these services to build their own families, but they're worried they're going to lose their constituents if they outwardly say that they support this. And so it's, again, that division, that sort of the haves and the have-nots. If you have the money to have an abortion in a state where you don't live, great, fly to Colorado, fly to California, fly to, the Northeast. And get the healthcare you need because you can pay out of pocket. But if you're poor, if you're, like a single parent, if you are in a, historically excluded group, like you're going to have lower access to care. And so then it actually keeps people who are already marginalized further marginalized and without choices. So I really think it's about socioeconomic status as well, because the people who would feel this if they didn't have money are not feeling it. and they're able to live their lives again back in, let's think about like all the famous people who, you know, had mistresses and then they had their mistresses have an abortion back, you know, before it was legal and all. It's the exact same thing that's happening right now with fertility care. And so the people who want it are getting it, but outwardly can say that they don't support it so that they stay in power. I mean, I'm like enraged. This gives me the chills, but like, I'm truly like, when my friends in a certain state, which will not be named, polled the actual people when they were going to the state house, it was over 30% had access to fertility care, IVF specifically, to build their own families, when they were outwardly saying this should be illegal.
Hypocrisy.
Yes. We live in a really dark world, but let's try to end on a slightly more positive note. Erica, what are some facts that people should know that might help reduce fear and anxiety about fertility today?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked that, Kristiyana, because I'm always looking for reasons for authentic hope, like hope grounded in science. So when I meet with patients in my clinic and I pull up the START calculator, which anybody can access, you know, it's basically on a website. You can type in, I actually type in like University of Aberdeen because like that's sort of, that's the best way to find it. You can actually look at what your personal success rate is, you know, somebody like you, Athalia, who's been through like more than 2 IVF cycles, it's not going to be all that helpful because it really only goes up to the second egg retrieval. So that's a limitation. But it looks at your age, your height, your weight, you know, fertility diagnosis, your AMH. And there's a calculator that says for your, well, actually, even goes up to the third IVF cycle, actually, it's a third 3. But it says, you know, based on all these statistics, based on like national data of like hundreds of thousands of cycles, what's your likelihood of having a live birth if you transfer sort of the embryos from your first cycle and the embryos from your second cycle and the embryos from your third cycle. So, you know, assuming a retrieval each time and using the embryos from that cycle to be clear. But I'm amazed, like when I used to pull this calculator 10 years ago, like it would be like the max success rate would be like 50%. And that wasn't a good prognosis patient. I mean, now I was in the room the other day with my fellow, and you know, we pulled up after 3 cycles, like an 88% chance of a live birth. And again, it presumes that people can access this and afford this. And there are some issues there too, but the science and the technology, I mean, back 40 years ago, we were lucky to have a single-digit percentage chance of success for an IVF cycle, like a 7% chance of a live birth was, and then, you know, 80 years ago, when this wasn't available, 60 years ago, people remained childless. And so these days we have the highest success rates with IVF that we've ever had before. Right? We have third-party reproduction. So that means if somebody doesn't have sperm, if, you know, they don't have eggs or their ovaries are not, you know, sort of not doing well, that we can, you know, bring in an egg donor as part of the equation. Again, not the right choice for everybody, but the technology does exist. And I think it's helped many, many people build their families in a beautiful way. And also, you know, gestational carriers, there's wonderful work being done right now. Again, very expensive. Most insurances don't cover it, but the technology is there such that if you've had cancer, if you've had, you know, multiple uterine surgeries, if you were born without a uterus, that maybe you're a gay male couple and you have infertility because of that, like then you can build your family in that way. So I think the technology is the best it's ever been. And, you know, yes, there's an attack on women's health research, you know, bringing in politics again, but I think that there are many people committed to the science, and we're still continuing to make progress. And so that gives me hope authentically in 2025 that we're headed in the right direction, and that, you know, the success rates now are better than they've ever been. And the reality is that most people, if they stick with it, are going to build their families. That is the reality. The other reality is that it's so hard and so stressful and so expensive that many people do, you know, drop off for various reasons. And so, you know, I'm on a mission to say, if it makes to stay, how can we support you in all the ways to make sure, you know, again, moving forward in a positive direction, authentic hope and reasons to move forward. But I think it shouldn't be the emotional. It also shouldn't be the financial, but sometimes it is. You know, how can we support people so that they can bridge to parenthood, but also in a way that they feel whole and intact and loved? Because, you know, if you get to the end of a marathon and you're like dying, you know, but you got to the finish line, that's not really the goal either. I think the whole goal is to say, okay, how can we make this a part of somebody's life as they're also, you know, fulfilling these other aspects? And how can we really nourish women through this process together?
Yes, this is so encouraging and such a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll make sure we link all the resources that you mentioned to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
And
thank you for the that you do. I mean, busting myths is one of the hardest things. And I think we hear a myth and we latch onto it, and then there's all this fear mongering. But I think if, sure, yes, let's worry about the things we need to worry about and then be proactive about what we can do. But if there's things that we're stressed about that there's really no reason to even stress about them, then please let's just let those go. And let's focus our attention on things that actually, bring us joy or we can do something about.
That's a great final thought. Thank you so much, and see you all next time on Malignant Myths.
Thank you again. Bye.
Bye.